Good morning. Sorry about the delay. So, we are looking at Gaussian beams now, and we were looking at various properties of the Gaussian beam. And we had come to the last property that I want to introduce, which was looking at the phase of the beam. Now, phase of any beam is important because we know that as light travels, the phase is changing. So, propagation changes phase. And while I might think of phase changing as the beam propagates, one also has to understand that if you have a beam whose phase changes in a particular way, that is actually the very definition of that beam. So if I say this is a Gaussian beam, or if this is a Laguerre Gaussian beam, if this is a beam with orbital angular momentum, how does a beam get defined as belonging to some category? It turns out actually you're defining that by looking at the way its phase changes as it propagates. So it should be fairly clear that propagation causes a phase change. And as a beam propagates, the phase is changed. But every beam does not change phase in the same way when that beam travels through a distance z. So you could have different beams traveling through the same medium. So the medium has refractive index n. Each beam travels a distance z in that medium, maybe even in the seemingly same direction. And yet, each beam will behave completely differently depending on the phase change acquired by the. So you can decide, do you want to say it's because of its phase nature it propagates in a certain way, or because it propagates in that way its phase has changed? Okay, so it's really important to look at the phase of the Gaussian beam, and over here we have written out just the terms of the exponential that indicate the phase. There's actually a minus sign here, right, in front of this. If you look at the expression, it's exponential minus jkz minus k rho squared by 2 capital R plus zeta of z. Okay? But the relative phase is shown correctly here because the signs are relatively correct. Now, what we ended the last class with was simplifying this expression. It has 3 terms in it, and we said let's start by looking at when rho is 0, and since rho is the root of x squared plus y squared, 0 means you're looking on the axis. Okay, and if that term goes to 0, you're left only with kz minus zeta of z. Zeta of z is nothing but the tan inverse of z by z naught. So these 2 terms are what control the way the phase of this Gaussian beam changes as it travels. But it's the way the phase changes on the axis. Okay, so we know, if we take a spherical wave, for example, we know that if this is the origin, the wave fronts go out radially in all directions. For a Gaussian beam, let's say this was the beam waist, and we'll see how I know how to draw these images. Initially, the wavefront is a planar wavefront, and then as the beam propagates, it becomes more and more spherical in nature. And what is controlling this behavior is the phase, but by putting rho equal to 0, we're saying there's a certain phase change that's happening on the axis. This term indicates that the phase change that happens to the beam is slightly different when you go off the axis. And what controls or finally determines the nature or the shape of a wavefront is going to be how the phase changes all through the beam. So what happens at the axis, what happens away from the axis. That combined change is what gives you your resultant wavefront. So right now, just looking at what happens on axis, I can say that on axis, I see that kz is nothing but the phase of a plane wave. So on axis, the Gaussian wave phase is delayed from that of a plane wave by an amount zeta of z. Okay, so this is nothing but a phase delay of the Gaussian beam with respect to the plane wave. And that's the figure that I have drawn over here in this, where the red lines, I've not drawn this correctly. The plane waves are going to be lambda apart. Okay, so it's equidistant. So these lines should be, consider them that they're equidistant, okay, indicating the wavefronts of a plane wave. And you can see that if this were the waist of the Gaussian beam, here it's in phase, but as the wavefronts move, there is a extra delay, and that is going to go on increasing. Okay, and that is because of this delay. That's what happens on axis. Okay, now it's useful to look at these two terms. So we know that on axis, the phase of the wavefront changes in a certain way. Okay, but what is happening to the wavefront is not, of course, only what's happening on axis. It's happening also at regions away from the axis. So it's instructive to go back then to this expression. I don't know if you remember, but we had written this out. This was, so we have this capital R of z that appears in the phase term, and I had defined it as z into 1 plus z naught by z the whole square. Okay. So let's look at this expression. Okay. Now it appears in the phase argument as part of this term. And if I wanted to understand this term, I really need to look at it a little closer and see it is rather similar to the phase change that I would get if I had a spherical wave. Okay. This term is what is controlling the bending of the wavefront. So if I had only kz minus zeta of z, if this term didn't exist, the only difference between the Gaussian beam and the plane wave would be that the Gaussian beam had a phase delay compared to the plane wave. But it would be more or less plane in nature, right? Except the wavefronts would have had a phase delay. What makes the Gaussian beam lie somewhere between the ideal plane wave and the ideal spherical wave is this term that moves it from the plane wave and gives it the bending of the beam. Okay? Now, the radius of curvature is a function of z. So, as the wave travels, the curvature is taking on a different size, right? It is also a function of z naught, which is an inherent parameter of your beam. How does this r of z vary? So let's look at two different cases. Let's say I take the case when z is equal to 0. Where is z equal to 0? At the waist. So at z equal to 0, what happens to my expression for r of z? I can always write it like this, right? So at z equal to 0, the first term vanishes, but the second term goes to infinity. So at z equal to 0, r of z will go to infinity, right? What happens at z equal to infinity, very far away from the waist? In this case, the first term blows up, whereas the second term vanishes. So the result is the same, r of z tends to infinity. Okay. So And what does R of Z in being infinite imply? What kind of beam is that? It's a plane wave, right? It means the radius of curvature is infinite. It's nothing but a plane wave. So now you're getting the sense the Gaussian beam at the waist behaves like a plane wave, and very far away from the waist again behaves like a plane wave. And in between that has a spherical nature. So it's very, very different from that ideal mathematical plane wave or spherical. It's good to look at this graph where you plot R of Z versus Z, right? And if you actually plot it, it's going to look something like this. So it's if you, and this is Z naught, right? So what is this graph telling you? Below Z naught, the lower you go, of course, with Z tending to 0, the radius of curvature shoots up and actually will hit infinity. As you move further and further away from the waist, the radius of curvature is going to hit infinity. But of course, that's a slower process. So you have less of a slope there. And you have the smallest radius of curvature actually at the Rayleigh range. So again, another point to reinforce the importance of that Rayleigh range. Okay. Okay. If Z, in fact, if I look at this expression, if I take Z greater than Z naught, not infinite, but greater than Z naught, then how does this term reduce? R of Z. How will R of Z reduce? It's going to reduce back down to, so R of Z would reduce back down to just Z, right? So again, if I'm at Z naught, that's where I have the largest curvature. If I go beyond that, this starts becoming like a spherical. Okay. Because I'm going to have K rho squared by 2Z. Okay. So this phase delay that arises, this zeta, you will often see it called the Gouy effect or the Gouy phenomenon. Okay, and what zeta of Z is telling us, as the wave travels, it is acquiring a phase delay compared to a plane wave. And actually, the phase delay as a Gaussian wave travels from minus infinity to plus infinity is a full pi radians. Okay? So you can plot that phase delay. Versus Z. Okay? And what this curve is going to look like is something like this. And symmetrically on the other side. Slightly increasing. This is Z naught. The same distance over here as minus Z naught. This is pi by 4. This is minus pi by 4. And this asymptotically tends to pi by 2. What does that mean? As the wave travels, and if you consider it traveling from minus infinity to plus infinity, compared to a plane wave that traveled that same distance, it would have been delayed by a full pi radians. Okay, and again, another data point for the Rayleigh range. Over the Rayleigh range, however, the phase change. So as the wave travels through the length of 2Z naught, its phase changes by pi by 2. Okay, so you can see the rate of change of phase is also different as the wave propagates. Okay, so keep in mind these properties of a Gaussian beam. Okay, we have used the concepts of a plane wave and a spherical wave to understand the Gaussian beam, and we can see that the Gaussian beam has the nature of the plane wave in some places, the nature of a spherical wave in other places. Okay? But it is, of course, its very own unique beam. Okay? The other key point you should have got from this is the phase is crucial because phase defines this beam. I call it a Gaussian beam because of the way it behaves, and I describe that behavior using the phase. Okay. Now, there's one other parameter. It's not a Gaussian beam parameter. It's not always defined as part of Gaussian beam parameters, but it's a very important parameter that people use if they're working with lasers. So I want to mention it here. It's called the beam quality. It's referred to as the M squared parameter. And if you're using a laser or buying a laser, you would always look at the M squared parameter. Now, the M squared parameter is a simple definition. It is the divergence of the beam emerging from this source compared to the divergence of an ideal beam with the same omega naught. So, if I have a beam, a Gaussian beam, so an ideal Gaussian beam, it is lambda wavelength. It emerges with the spot size of omega naught. Inherent to it then is the theta naught or the z naught, right? And so I can say this beam has a divergence theta naught. Now, if I take another beam with, say, of the same wavelength, and it emerges with the same omega naught, ideally, if it is a Gaussian beam, it should have the same theta naught. Okay? But in reality, when you generate light, the quality of the beam coming out varies a lot depending upon how exactly that beam was generated. Right? Especially when you have higher power sources, the nature, the method by which you generate the higher power affects the quality of the beam. After all, why am I getting out a Gaussian beam? It is a mode of the cavity. And the mode of that cavity, if I change some parameter or if I'm using much higher power, that mode quality gets affected. So the way to compare is to compare the divergence of the beam you have with an ideal Gaussian beam of same lambda and same omega. So this ratio is what we call the M squared ratio. And I can always define it in terms of theta naught because theta naught can be defined, of course, in terms of omega naught and lambda. So if I do that, M squared is, of course, this stays the same, but I will write it as pi omega naught by lambda. And often, because people want to talk about diameters, you may see it written like this so that it's 2 omega naught. Okay. Now, what's the best beam quality you can have? If I say you have the best beam, what will its M squared parameter be? 1. So, the best beam quality is M squared equal to 1. In other words, you're saying the divergence of this new source when compared to the other one are the same. So I can never have M squared less than 1. And you always strive to create a source that will generate an M squared as close to 1 as possible. many sources will achieve close to 1. But again, as I said, if you're working with very high power sources, you may be quite far away from 1. With the Gaussian beam, you've had this concept, there is some inherent nature to the beam, right? So we've been referring to omega naught, z naught, and always, though I may not always explicitly say, lambda is also playing a role in it. This means, this inherent nature of the beam means that if I have a source and the Gaussian beam emerges from this source, so this is the wavelength and it has omega naught, that means this beam has a fixed z naught and a fixed theta. Now you could ask, then that mean I can never change it, I'm stuck with this omega naught forever. You can change the omega naught, of course. Why do we use lenses? You use lenses to change focal spot size. So I could put in a lens, right? And doing so would then, of course, maybe I have a lens that tightly focuses, so it does this. Now, in this region, the beam came out with an omega naught, a z naught, a theta naught. After the lens, the beam will have an omega naught dash, a theta naught dash, and a z naught dash. But they are not completely independent of what the input values were. Okay? So, in fact, if I say the lens magnified, caused magnification, so I change the spot size by a factor m. M here is not this m, okay? This m is never referred to as m. There's no m and m squared. It is always called the m squared parameter. So here I'm talking about magnification. So let's say the lens magnified, and remember magnification could be less than 1. So I could have a smaller spot size. So omega naught dash is the transformed value of the spot because of the optical system that I'm using with magnification m. But if omega naught dash changes in this way, it automatically implies the new divergence then is the old divergence divided by the. In other words, omega naught dash, right, theta naught dash is equal to omega naught theta. And this, if you will, is like the uncertainty principle in Gaussian beams. Right? Because the more sure I make the spot, that means I make it smaller and smaller. I'm saying the spot isn't spread, there's no uncertainty in the spot. I make the spot smaller and smaller and smaller. Can pinpoint its location more and more and more accurately. The moment I do that, the beam starts diverging more and more faster. Alternatively, I can decrease the divergence, and that means the spot size is going to get larger. Right? So I can use 100 lenses and transform my Gaussian beam with these 100 lenses, and each time, yes, I get a new omega naught and I get a new theta naught, but I will never escape the initial inherent property. It came out with an omega naught and a theta naught, and that relationship, that product is going to stay the same for this beam throughout, no matter how I manipulate it. Okay? If I want to manipulate it, I have to generate a beam with a different nature altogether. Okay? This product is called the beam parameter product, or often just reduced to and And if you look back at this expression, I can write this as pi by lambda theta naught omega naught. So this m squared it can be written in terms of the beam parameter product, and therefore actually you can see the order of the beam parameter product is of lambda by 2 because m squared is equal to. Okay, so with this you should start getting the idea that there is only so much control you have over the beam. Here I'm showing you that it is a function basically of the wavelength, and there is only so much I can achieve with a source of a certain wavelength. And this idea we have met before because we've looked at resolution and we've said resolution is also related to wavelength. I may want to have a very, very small spot size, but it is finally a function of wavelength. And this idea is coming through here again in the Gaussian beam because you're saying the order of the beam parameter product is lambda by pi. And that product is again relating to spot size and divergence. Okay. So you can think of the m squared. If you have an m squared value that is greater than 1, you can think of it as indicating the non-Gaussian nature of that particular beam that you're looking at. So if you say m squared equal to 1, you're looking at a Gaussian beam, and for any other value you're seeing, and 1.1 may be still considered Gaussian, but of course you go to higher and higher m squared values, you say the beam is going further and further away from its Gaussian nature. Okay. And in fact, if that were the case, the expression we wrote down for the phase of the Gaussian beam, that means that beam doesn't exactly follow that expression. It means there is some other term in its phase that accounts for its difference from. Right? So we're not saying this is a Gaussian beam, it has the same expression, but it's behaving differently. The very fact that a beam has an m squared greater than 1 means that its phase will be different from that of the Gaussian. Some other term or terms will exist in its phase. Okay? Okay. Now, the next part that we need to move to really is looking at how the Gaussian beam gets transformed. Because our interest is always, how do I use? In ray optics, it was how do I focus light down and achieve something? How do I do imaging with aberration correction? We're not doing anything very different here. All we're saying is the systems that we're working with, you can't anymore assume ray optics. You have to take the wave nature into account. But again, I want to manipulate this wave with optics. So the next part that I need to really look at is how does a lens transform my Gaussian beam? How does a mirror transform my Gaussian beam? Okay, but before we go to that, I want to actually look at when I think of waves, how does any optical element transform a wave? So let's look at that in general and then use the results we get from that to looking at what happens with a Gaussian beam and optics. Okay, so the next section is on transmittance. Let's just look at transmittance of an element. Okay. Now, transmittance, as we always normally assume that propagation is along the z direction. So if you assume you have an element, let's say in this case I have a transparent slab, maybe a glass slab of thickness d naught, right, and refractive index n. When I say transmittance of this element, what I want to find out is if I have waves incident on this element, what happens to them after that. So the transmittance is nothing but the field after the element, and let me just call it D. The ratio of the field after the element to the field before the element. We can make the assumption here that this glass is perfectly transparent, so there's no absorption of any kind, and for the purpose of this discussion we will neglect any reflections that occur. So we assume there's no change in amplitude as the wave travels through this element. My element right now is a glass slab of constant thickness, okay? But I am going to assume no amplitude change. What does change as the wave travels through the element? The phase changes, okay? And by taking the ratio of the fields, remember the fields are always A exponential J phi, right? So I have, and I'm saying amplitude doesn't change. So there is some J phi before and then there is a new phase after. So really I'm just taking the new phase after as my transmittance. Okay, so this, I could consider this to be a phase element. There's no change in amplitude. Now if I say that it's n refractive index, the phase change is going to be 2 pi by lambda into n into the thickness of this glass. Okay, or that 2 pi by lambda we can say is k naught. So the transmittance of this very simple element then is nothing but the exponential of this. Okay. Okay, so let's go to the next element. This was simple, too simple. Let's say I have an element and this element has variable thickness. Something like this. Okay. So at no point is it larger than D naught. D naught is the widest it ever is at any point. But it at some places the thickness is less than D. So I can actually say the thickness here is a function of x and y. X and y is the plane perpendicular to the direction of propagation. And so if I'm taking into account the phase change, I then, here it didn't really matter. I wrote T of xy, but this was the same transmittance everywhere because the thickness was the same everywhere. Therefore, the phase change was the same. Now I can't ignore the x and y. I really have to take into account the transmittance at every point due to the different phase at every point. Okay. Now, let's take some point over here. Let's take this point. Let's say the thickness here is d of xy. So what is a ray or the part of the wave that is traveling to that particular section of the element? What is it seeing in terms of the phase change? Well, it's traveling through two different media, right? It travels through a thickness d of xy, a medium of refractive index n, but in that same line, it also travels a thickness d naught minus d of xy through air, right? And that happens at every position of this element. So the total phase shift then is the phase shift due to, so minus j q naught n d of xy, and the phase shift, so it's a product of the phase shift due to passage through the glass slab and then also through this let me just write it as d naught minus d. Okay, it is d which is a function of x and y. So if I club related terms together here, I can pull out this exponential minus jk naught d naught, and what will come in the remaining terms is n minus 1. And if you were to do this at every point of the slab, right, you are going to get the same expression, of course, with this value or this term d of xy representing the thickness of the slab at that particular position. So you have two terms here, product of these two terms, but this actually is a constant term and it appears everywhere. So in principle, if I was trying to find out the effects of the relative phase differences, I could actually leave this part out because it appears everywhere. What is actually causing the change is this variation, because some parts of the beam see a thickness of some dx of y, d of x and y, and at other places it's seeing a different thickness, a different d. And this is what is going to change the wavefront. So before this, if I had a plane wave, you would have had waves with this wavefront coming, and here after this it's going to do something like this. And that change in curvature is arisen because of the variation in the thickness. It's arisen because of this. This is like a DC shift. Everything was shifted and then this curvature. So in order to get the shape, I can leave out that DC shift. In order to get the actual phase, I have to include everything. Okay. So this is what happens when I have an element with some arbitrary or random variation of thickness. Now, why are we going step by step like this? Because of course, finally, we are not usually using elements of random thickness. What we are using will be an element of some known shape like a lens. So I want to know what is the phase shift caused by a lens. And again, just to make it simple, we will take a plano-convex lens. Okay, just to make it simple. Okay. So it's plano-convex, it's a spherical lens. So let's say I'm considering this point. This goes out to this, which is the center of curvature. This is the radius. And if we drop a perpendicular to this, I call this point P and this point Q. Now again, I have varying thickness of dxy across this lens. Right? It's thickest at the center and symmetrically it reduces in thickness as you go to the edge. So I want to now find out an expression for d of xy and then substitute that into this equation. And that will give me the transmittance of a lens. Right? So how do I find out an expression for d of xy? So I can use some simple geometry over here. We have used a plano-convex lens. That means this is spherical in nature, right? So d of xy, the thickness anywhere is going to be this distance PC, which is nothing but the radius of curvature r minus PQ. So let's say I'm looking at the thickness, right, at this particular point. Yes? Okay. But what is PQ? PQ can be calculated how? It can be calculated by R minus QC. And to get an idea of how we'll do that, we've been looking at this image from the side. If I looked at it, directly, this is the optical axis, this is the point P, Q lies behind it. I can't draw it. It's on the optical axis behind it. And that point that we are measuring D at, well, maybe that point is somewhere over here. So I want this distance actually, right? So in other words, I can write this is R minus, what will it be? Now I have a right angle triangle, but it's a tilted right angle triangle, but that doesn't matter. I can always pull it back and just treat it as a right angle triangle, right? So I'm going to write this as R squared minus X squared plus Y squared to the power. It's D naught. Yes. Go back and look at the figure we had over here. In order to find out the thickness anywhere, we took the maximum thickness minus the distance traveled in air. Right? Or to find the distance traveled in air, we took the maximum thickness minus the thickness of the glass slab at that point. So we're doing exactly the same thing here, except now rather than saying we have an arbitrary variation in thickness, we have a specific variation in thickness. So at the thickest point, the lens has a thickness D naught or a width D naught. And then if we subtract PQ, that will give us this. So at that position, it gives us the thickness of the glass. Okay. Okay. So if I simplify and write this, as well as take into account the fact that X squared plus Y squared can be less than R squared. Why? Because if you think about it, the curvature of your lens, it can have a fairly large radius of curvature compared to the lateral size of your lens. And that's basically what this is saying, that your lens it's not as large as the radius of curvature. So this is not at all a strange assumption to make. Okay. But if you make this assumption, this will then reduce very simply to because this R squared will come out and get subtracted from this one here, and then you're left only with this divided by 2. Now I can put this into this expression over here. What was that expression? That was the transmittance of a glass plate whose thickness varied according to that D, small d. And now I'm doing exactly the same thing, except I'm saying the thickness variation has this particular form. So if I go back and write T of xy, this is the transmittance of the lens, is exponential minus j k naught d naught exponential minus j k naught n minus 1 d naught minus x squared plus y squared by 2r. So again, you see for the lens, this is a constant term, and so is this part, this product. This is also a constant. So I can write all the constants as some h naught. Okay. What are you left with? You're left with the part of the exponential that will contain, because that varies depending on where you are on the lens. in other words, where the x and y values are. So you will have j k naught x squared plus y squared 2r. Everything else goes into the constant. N minus 1, right? N minus 1. So in fact, I can write this as h naught exponential j x squared plus y squared k naught by 2f. If I say that the focal length of this lens is n minus 1 by, 1 by f is this. Is that right? And you'll often see this expression written like this, or written j k naught rho squared by 2. So in today's class, we finished looking at the properties of the Gaussian beam. We saw that inherent natures, your ideas or concepts of the Rayleigh range Z0 should have got reinforced, because we saw that it's very much a part of the inherent nature of the Gaussian beam. Omega naught, lambda, theta naught, Z0. These are related. And for a particular beam, it means that you're going to have certain values for these. And optics cannot change. You may be able to change one parameter, but that forces the other parameters to change in a certain way. We then looked at the m squared parameter, which gave us an idea of how to quantify how Gaussian a beam is. So I want a Gaussian beam. A Gaussian beam is an easy beam to work with. It gives a good focal spot. But not all sources will generate a Gaussian beam. And the m squared, or the parameter, allowed us a means of quantifying the Gaussian, how Gaussian a beam is. And then we want to move on to looking at how does a Gaussian beam change or transform when it interacts with lenses and mirrors. But in order to do that, we wanted to see how does any beam transform, because up till now we've only been looking at rays, not waves. And when you look at waves and I talk about its interaction, their interaction with an optical element, their phase is going to change. So we define this parameter, the transmittance, for a phase element. And then we went step by step as to how you will calculate the phase of a known element like a lens. We have calculated the transmittance now, or arrived at the transmittance for a plano-convex lens. But you'll see if you do it for any lens, it is going to reduce down to this form, where it is a function of the focal length of the lens. So we'll start off in the next class taking into account how a Gaussian beam actually changes when it goes through a lens. Okay.